"Sign it," my daughter-in-law said, sliding the papers across the polished oak table as if they were nothing more than a dinner menu. "You have nothing left anyway." My son didn't look at me when he nodded, his eyes fixed somewhere just beyond my shoulder, as though I had already disappeared from the room, as though the woman who had raised him, fed him, and stood beside his father for 42 years had become invisible overnight. I picked up the pen with steady fingers, the kind of steadiness that only comes when something inside you has already broken and settled into a quiet, unshakable place, and I signed exactly where she told me to, my name flowing across the paper in the same careful script I had used on birthday cards and school permission slips decades ago. Neither of them noticed the way I paused for half a second after the last letter, not out of hesitation, but out of something closer to acceptance, the kind that doesn't ask for fairness anymore. "That's everything," she said with a small, satisfied smile, gathering the documents into a neat stack as if she were organizing receipts after a shopping trip, and I simply nodded, folding my hands in my lap, letting the silence stretch just long enough for them to believe it meant defeat. The room felt different in that moment, not colder, not heavier, just clearer, as if all the illusions had finally burned away and left only the truth standing between us, plain and undeniable. My son cleared his throat and muttered something about how this was for the best, how the house was too much for me now, how they would take care of things, the same vague promises people make when they don't intend to keep them, and I listened without interrupting, without correcting him, because there was no need. I had already heard everything I needed to hear long before we sat down at that table. I had seen it in the way the locks were changed without telling me, in the way my belongings were quietly moved out of the master bedroom and into the smaller guest room at the back of the house, in the way conversations stopped the moment I entered a room and resumed in hushed tones the moment I left. It hadn't happened all at once. It never does. It happened slowly, politely, wrapped in reasonable explanations and careful smiles, until one day you realize you are no longer part of your own life. "We'll have someone help you pack," she added, her voice light, almost cheerful, as though she were offering me a kindness, and I met her eyes for the first time that afternoon, really looked at her, at the confidence there, the certainty that she had already won, and I gave her the smallest smile in return, the kind that reveals nothing at all. Because the truth was, I had known about the papers before they ever placed them in front of me. I had known about the transfer, the accounts, the way everything had been arranged so neatly that I would be left with nothing but a suitcase and a polite explanation. And still I had come. Still I had signed. Because sometimes the only way to see the end of a story is to let it play out exactly the way your enemies expect it to. They thought they had taken everything from me in that quiet, sunlit room with its polished table and neatly stacked documents. They thought I had agreed to disappear. And as I sat there, hands folded, watching them gather what they believed was now theirs, I let them believe it, completely, without resistance, without a single word of protest, because the moment that truly mattered had not happened yet. And when it did, it wouldn't be me who spoke. 48 hours before I signed those papers, the house was still quiet in a way that felt almost peaceful if you did not listen too closely, the kind of quiet that settles into old walls after years of routine, where every clock ticks just a little louder and every floorboard remembers the weight of footsteps that no longer come. And I sat alone at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, watching the early morning light stretch across the countertop as if nothing in. The world had changed, even though everything had, even though I could feel it in the air like a storm that had not yet broken. I had woken up before sunrise, as I often did now, my body still keeping the rhythm it had learned over decades of making breakfast for a man who would never walk down those stairs again. And, for a moment, just a brief moment, I allowed myself to pretend that nothing was wrong, that I was simply waiting for the sound of his footsteps, the familiar clearing of his throat, the quiet greeting that had started every day of my adult life. But the silence remained, and it was in that silence that I began to understand how much had shifted around me without a single word being said. The first sign had been small, almost too small to notice if I had not been paying attention. A missing set of keys from the hook by the door, replaced with a new set I did not recognize, followed by a polite explanation from Lauren that they had upgraded the locks for security, something she said with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes, as if she were testing how much I would question, how far she could go before I pushed back. And I remember nodding, thanking her even, because that was what I had always done. Kept the peace, trusted that family meant something steady and unbreakable. Then there were the conversations that seemed to stop when I entered a room. The quick exchange of glances between her and Michael, the way his voice would soften in a way that felt rehearsed, careful, as if every word had been chosen in advance, and I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things, that grief had a way of distorting ordinary moments into something heavier than they really were. But deep down, somewhere beneath the habit of giving people the benefit of the doubt, I knew better. I noticed how the mail began arriving already opened, neatly stacked on the counter with small sticky notes marking where I needed to sign or review, how the bank statements no longer came addressed directly to me, but instead seemed to pass through their hands first, accompanied by casual updates about how they were helping to manage everything now, how it would be easier this way, less stressful, and again, I said nothing, because questioning it would have meant admitting that something was wrong, and I was not ready to do that, not yet. That morning, as I sat there with the untouched coffee, I heard Lauren's voice from the hallway, low and measured, speaking on the phone in the tone she used when she wanted to sound both polite and in control, and though I could not hear every word, I caught enough to understand the direction things were moving. Phrases like transfer and authorization and final signatures slipping through the quiet like threads I could not ignore, and I remember the way my hand tightened slightly around the cup, not in anger, not in fear, but in recognition, the kind that settles slowly and leaves no room for doubt once it arrives. When she walked into the kitchen a few minutes later, she greeted me as she always did, with that same carefully practiced warmth, asking if I had slept well, if I needed anything from the store, as though the conversation I had just overheard had never happened, as though the house itself was not already shifting beneath my feet. And I smiled back, just as I had smiled the day I signed those papers, because by then, I had already made a decision, though I had not yet fully admitted it to myself. I would not confront them, not yet, not in a way they could prepare for or defend against, because I had begun to understand that whatever they were planning had been in motion long before I noticed the first sign, and reacting too soon would only give them time to adjust, to close whatever doors I might still be able to open. Instead, I watched, quietly, carefully, allowing each small detail to settle into place, the changed locks, the controlled mail, the hushed conversations, each one a piece of a larger pattern that was becoming impossible to ignore. And as the morning light grew brighter and the house slowly came to life around me, I realized something that would stay with me long after I left that kitchen table, something simple and undeniable, that this was no longer my home in the way it had once been, and, more importantly, that they believed I had not yet noticed, that I was still the same woman who would accept whatever was placed in front of her without question, and it was in that quiet misunderstanding that their confidence began to grow, and in that same moment, my silence began to take on a very different meaning. The call came just after noon, at a time of day when the house usually settled into a quiet rhythm, when sunlight filled the living room and dust seemed to hang motionless in the air. And for a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail, because by then I had already learned that most unexpected interruptions carried something I was not ready to hear. But something in me shifted, something subtle and insistent, and I reached for the phone anyway, answering with the same calm tone I had used my entire life, the kind that never revealed more than it needed to. Mrs. Hayes, the voice on the other end said, measured and professional, the kind of voice that belonged to someone accustomed to delivering information that changed things. This is Jonathan Pierce. I handled some of your husband's legal affairs. For a second, I did not respond, not because I did not recognize the name, but because I did, because it carried with it a weight I had not expected to feel again so soon, a reminder of conversations that had taken place long before the house grew quiet, long before everything began to shift beneath my feet. I remember, I said finally, my voice steady, though my fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the table. There was a brief pause, not awkward, not uncertain, just deliberate, as if he were choosing his next words with care, and when he spoke again, his tone had changed, just enough to make me sit a little straighter, just enough to make me listen differently. I believe there are some matters you should be aware of, he said, and something in that sentence settled into place, something that connected with everything I had been quietly observing over the past 2 days. Every small change, every polite explanation that no longer quite held together when examined too closely. I did not ask him what he meant right away, because I had learned that questions often gave people time to adjust their answers, and instead I let the silence stretch just long enough for him to continue on his own, which he did, as though he had expected that response. Your husband made certain arrangements, he said. Contingencies, in case decisions were made without your full understanding or consent. The words were simple, carefully chosen, but their meaning was not, and I felt something inside me shift again, not with surprise, not exactly, but with recognition, the kind that arrives when a piece of a puzzle you did not know you were assembling suddenly fits into place. I glanced toward the hallway, half expecting to hear footsteps, to feel the presence of someone listening just beyond the door, but the house remained quiet, holding its breath in that same suspended way it had all morning, and I lowered my voice slightly, though there was no one there to hear it. What kind of arrangements? I asked, and even as the question left my lips, I realized that part of me already understood the answer, or at least the shape of it. Documents that ensure your interests are protected, he replied, but only if certain conditions are met. There it was again, that careful precision, that sense that everything had been considered long before this moment. And for the first time in days, I felt something that was not uncertainty, not confusion, but clarity, quiet and steady, like the surface of a lake before a storm. He did not rush, did not overwhelm me with details, and I appreciated that more than I could have explained, because what he was offering was not just information, but time to understand, to think, to decide how I would move forward. I would recommend that you come by the office, he continued, so we can review everything in person. I could hear the unspoken part of his sentence, the understanding that whatever was happening in my home was not something that should be discussed over the phone, not something that could be reduced to a few sentences without losing its meaning, and I nodded, even though he could not see me. I will be there, I said, and as I spoke those words, I realized that the decision had already been made, not just to meet with him, but to stop pretending that I did not see what was unfolding around me. When the call ended, I remained seated for a moment, the phone still in my hand, listening to the silence that followed, and it felt different now, less uncertain, less heavy, as though something had shifted just enough to change the direction of everything that came next. I set the phone down carefully, the same way I had set down my pen in that other room, the same controlled movement that revealed nothing to anyone watching, and I stood up slowly, smoothing my hands over the fabric of my blouse as though preparing for something ordinary, something routine, even though I knew that what lay ahead was anything but. From the hallway, I heard Lauren's voice again, light and confident, speaking to Michael in the same quiet tones they had been using for days, and for the first time, I listened without uncertainty, without trying to interpret or excuse what I heard, because now I understood that whatever they believed they were doing, whatever plans they had set in motion, they were not the only ones who had been preparing, and they were not the only ones who understood how these things worked. I walked toward the window, looking out at the familiar street, the same stretch of pavement I had watched for years, and I realized that the life I thought I knew had already begun to shift long before this moment, long before the locks were changed or the papers were drawn up, and that what I had taken for kindness, for care, had been something else entirely, something quieter and far more deliberate. And as I stood there, watching the afternoon light settle across the yard, I made a decision that felt less like a reaction and more like a return to something I had almost forgotten, the part of me that did not need to raise its voice to be heard, that did not need to argue to be understood, the part that could wait, observe, and act only when the moment was right. And in that moment, I knew exactly what I was going to do next. The drive to Jonathan Pierce's office took just under 20 minutes, but it felt longer in a way that had nothing to do with distance and everything to do with the quiet recalculations happening in my mind. Each mile marker passing like a reminder that I was moving towards something that had been set in motion long before I understood it, and I kept my hands steady on the wheel, my posture straight, the same way I had carried myself through every difficult moment in my life, because I had learned that composure was not just about appearances, it was about control, about choosing how much of yourself you allowed the world to see. The building itself was exactly as I remembered, understated, professional, the kind of place that did not need to announce its importance because it was already understood, and when I stepped inside, the air felt cooler, quieter, as though even sound behaved differently there, contained and deliberate. And I gave my name at the front desk with the same calm tone I had used on the phone, not rushed, not uncertain, simply present. Jonathan Pierce met me in the hallway, his expression respectful but unreadable, the kind of expression that did not offer comfort but did not need to, because it suggested something more useful than reassurance. It suggested preparation. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, extending his hand, and I took it, noting the firmness of his grip, the steadiness, small details that told me more than his words could have. "Thank you for coming in." I nodded, following him into his office, where everything was arranged with a precision that felt intentional rather than rigid, files aligned neatly, sunlight filtered through partially closed blinds, creating narrow bands of light across the desk, and for a moment, I was struck by how different this space felt from my home, how nothing here pretended to be anything other than what it was. He gestured for me to sit, and once I did, he took his place across from me, opening a folder that looked ordinary enough at first glance, but I knew better than to underestimate the weight of paper, because I had just signed documents that were meant to erase everything I had built, everything I had been part of for decades. "Your husband was very thorough," he began, his voice even, measured, the kind that did not need to rise to be heard, and I felt something tighten and then settle inside me at the mention of my husband, not grief exactly, but something steadier, something closer to recognition. He anticipated the possibility that decisions might be made under pressure or without full transparency. I listened without interrupting, my hands resting lightly in my lap, my posture unchanged, because I had already learned that silence often revealed more than questions ever could, and he seemed to understand that, allowing the information to unfold at its own pace rather than forcing it into something rushed or incomplete. He turned a page, sliding a document slightly forward, not enough for me to read it fully yet, but enough to signal that what he was about to say mattered. "There is a protective clause," he continued, "one that activates if ownership or control of certain assets is transferred under conditions that could be considered coercive or misrepresented." The words were precise, carefully chosen, but their meaning was unmistakable, and I felt the last pieces of uncertainty fall away, replaced by something far more stable, far more useful. I leaned forward slightly, not out of urgency, but out of focus, because now I understood that what had been happening in my home was not just a matter of family tension or misunderstanding. It was a calculated effort, one that my husband had seen coming long before I did. "And what happens when that clause is activated?" I asked, my voice calm, steady, carrying none of the weight that question might have held just a day earlier. Jonathan met my gaze directly, not avoiding it, not softening the answer. "The transfer becomes void," he said, "and control reverts according to the original estate structure, with additional restrictions placed on those who attempted the transfer." There was no need for him to elaborate further, no need to explain what that meant in practical terms, because I could already see it, could already understand how everything they believed they had secured could be undone in a single moment, not through confrontation, not through argument, but through the very system they thought they had used to their advantage. I sat back slowly, absorbing the simplicity of it, the quiet efficiency, and for the first time since the house had begun to change around me, I felt something close to certainty, not the fragile kind that depends on other people's choices, but the kind that comes from knowing exactly where you stand. "What do you need from me?" I asked, and even as I spoke, I realized that the question itself had changed, that I was no longer asking how to protect myself, but how to proceed. Jonathan closed the folder gently, his movements as controlled as everything else in the room. "Nothing yet," he said, "except patience." The words settled between us, simple and direct, and I nodded, because patience was something I understood, something I had practiced for most of my life without ever naming it as such. And now it had a purpose, a direction, something to move toward rather than something to endure. When I left the office, the afternoon light felt sharper, more defined, and as I stepped back into my car, I took a moment before starting the engine, allowing everything I had just learned to settle into place, not as a reaction, but as a plan, quiet and deliberate. And as I pulled out onto the road, I knew that when I returned home, I would not confront them. I would not reveal anything. Because the most effective move I could make was the one they would never see coming. The one that required nothing more than letting them continue exactly as they were, believing, completely, that they had already won. When I walked back into the house that afternoon, nothing had changed on the surface, and that was exactly the point. The same quiet living room, the same faint scent of lemon polish lingering on the furniture, the same muted hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen, all of it arranged in a way that suggested normalcy, stability, a life continuing as it always had. And yet I could see it clearly now, the careful positioning, the invisible boundaries that had been drawn without my consent, and, for the first time, I did not feel the need to question it or resist it, because I understood something they did not, something that allowed me to move through the space with a calm that was no longer rooted in habit, but in intention. Lauren was in the kitchen when I entered, her posture relaxed, her movements unhurried as she arranged a few items on the counter, and she looked up with that same composed expression she always wore, the one that balanced politeness with quiet control, and for a brief moment, our eyes met in a way that felt different from before, not confrontational, not revealing, just aware, as if both of us understood that something had shifted, even if only one of us knew exactly what it was. "You are back early," she said, her tone light, conversational, as though she had not spent the past 2 days quietly reorganizing every aspect of my life. And I nodded, setting my keys down in their usual place, the same place that had once felt like mine and now felt more like a habit I had not yet broken. "It was a short appointment," I replied, keeping my voice even, my expression neutral, offering nothing that could be read as suspicion or resistance, because I had already learned that the most effective way to move forward was to let them believe nothing had changed at all. Michael's voice drifted in from the other room, low and indistinct, followed by the soft sound of footsteps as he approached, and when he entered the kitchen, he paused for just a fraction of a second, as if assessing something, measuring the situation in a way that felt practiced rather than spontaneous. "Everything okay?" he asked, his tone careful, almost rehearsed, and I met his gaze with the same calm steadiness I had used at the lawyer's office, the same quiet composure that revealed nothing and asked for nothing in return. "Everything is fine," I said, and the simplicity of the words seemed to settle whatever unspoken concern had brought him into the room, because he nodded, satisfied, turning his attention back to Lauren as though the question had been nothing more than a routine check. I moved through the rest of the afternoon with a deliberate ease, taking my time with small, ordinary tasks, folding a dish towel, adjusting the placement of a chair, the kind of movements that suggested familiarity and comfort, even though I was fully aware that both of them were watching in their own subtle ways, not openly, not in a way that could be named, but in the quiet, observant manner of people who believed they were in control of a situation and wanted to confirm that nothing was slipping beyond their reach. At dinner, the conversation remained light, surface level, filled with small updates and polite exchanges that carried no real meaning, and I participated just enough to maintain the illusion, offering a comment here, a nod there, never withdrawing completely, but never engaging deeply enough to invite questions, because I understood now that every word I spoke would be measured, interpreted, and possibly used to adjust whatever plan they had already set in motion. Lauren mentioned timelines, casually, as though discussing a renovation or a schedule change, phrases like, "by the end of the week," and "final steps," woven into the conversation with practiced ease, and I listened without reacting, without asking for clarification, because I no longer needed it. I already knew where all of this was leading, and more importantly, I knew how it would end. After dinner, I excused myself earlier than usual, not abruptly, not in a way that would draw attention, but with the same quiet politeness I had always used, and as I walked down the hallway toward the smaller room that had been prepared for me, I noticed again how everything had been rearranged with such care, my belongings reduced, simplified, as though someone had already decided what I needed and what I did not, and for a moment, I allowed myself to pause, to take in the full extent of it, not with anger, not with sadness, but with a clarity that left no room for either. I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands resting lightly in my lap, the same posture I had held at the table when I signed those papers, and I let the silence settle around me, steady and complete, because now it no longer felt empty. It felt intentional, like a space I could use rather than endure. Down the hall, I could hear their voices again, low and confident, discussing details they believed were already resolved, and I closed my eyes for just a moment, not to escape, not to retreat, but to fix something in place, a decision that had been forming since the moment I answered that phone call, a decision that required nothing more than patience, precision, and the willingness to let them continue exactly as they were. They believed I had accepted everything, that I had stepped aside without resistance, that the papers I signed had ended the story in their favor, and as I sat there in that quiet room, listening to the soft murmur of voices beyond the door, I allowed that belief to remain untouched, because it was not something I needed to challenge. It was something I needed them to hold on to, completely, and without question, right up until the moment it would no longer matter. The next morning unfolded with the same quiet precision, as though the house itself had learned to follow a script, every movement measured, every sound softened, and I moved through it just as carefully, not disrupting the rhythm, not drawing attention to anything that might suggest I had begun to see beyond it, because by then I understood that the strength of their plan depended entirely on one assumption, that I would remain exactly as I had always been, predictable, trusting, and willing to accept whatever was placed in front of me without question. Lauren was already at the kitchen counter when I entered, reviewing something on her tablet, her posture relaxed but focused, and she glanced up with a brief smile that carried the same quiet confidence I had come to recognize, the kind that does not need to prove itself because it believes it has already succeeded. "We should finalize everything today," she said, her tone casual, as though she were discussing a minor errand rather than the complete transfer of a life's worth of decisions, and I nodded, pouring myself a cup of coffee with steady hands, the simple act grounding in a way that required no effort, because I had already decided how this would unfold. "Of course," I replied, keeping my voice even, my expression unchanged, offering nothing that could be interpreted as resistance or hesitation, and I noticed the way her shoulders relaxed slightly, the way that single word seemed to confirm everything she believed about me. Michael joined us a few moments later, his movements slower, more deliberate, as though he were still adjusting to the role he had chosen to play, and when he looked at me, there was something in his expression that flickered briefly before settling into the same neutral composure he had worn the day before. "The appointment is at 11, he said, his tone careful, almost rehearsed, and I nodded again, as though I needed the reminder, as though I had not already built the entire morning around that single moment. The drive to the office was quiet, the three of us moving through familiar streets in a silence that felt heavier than it had any right to be, filled with unspoken assumptions and carefully avoided truths, and I sat in the back seat, watching the world pass by in steady, predictable patterns, houses, trees, intersections, all of it unchanged, all of it indifferent to the quiet shift that was about to take place inside a room just a few miles ahead. When we arrived, Lauren moved with a quiet efficiency, gathering her things, smoothing the front of her jacket, her movements controlled and precise, while Michael lingered for just a moment longer than necessary, as though something inside him had not fully settled, and I stepped out of the car without hesitation, my posture straight, my pace unhurried, matching their rhythm exactly, giving them no reason to question what they already believed. Inside, the office felt the same as it had the day before, cool, composed, untouched by the tension that seemed to follow us in, and Jonathan Pierce was waiting, his presence as steady as ever, his expression unchanged, offering the same measured greeting he had given me before, but this time, there was something else beneath it, something subtle but unmistakable, a quiet awareness of the roles each of us believed we were playing. "Please, have a seat," he said, gesturing toward the table, and we did, Lauren positioning herself with a slight forward lean, ready, confident, Michael sitting beside her, his hands resting on the edge of the table, while I took my place across from them, my posture relaxed, my hands folded lightly in my lap, exactly as they had been when I signed those papers the day before. The documents were placed in front of us, neatly arranged, each page aligned with the same careful precision that defined everything in that room, and Lauren reached for them immediately, her fingers moving with practiced familiarity, as though she had already rehearsed this moment, as though she had already seen the outcome unfold exactly as she intended. We reviewed everything already, she said, her tone smooth, controlled, directed more toward Jonathan than toward me, and he nodded, acknowledging her statement without confirming it, without adding anything that might disrupt the balance that had been so carefully constructed. I watched as she guided the process forward, pointing to specific sections, summarizing details, her voice steady, confident, filling the space with the quiet certainty of someone who believed every variable had been accounted for, and I listened without interruption, without correction, allowing each word to settle exactly where she placed it. Because I understood now that the most important part of this moment was not what was being said, but what was about to be revealed. When the final page was turned, when the last signature line was indicated, she glanced at me briefly, her expression composed, expectant, and I met her gaze with the same calm steadiness I had maintained from the beginning, offering no resistance, no hesitation, only the quiet confirmation she had been waiting for. I reached for the pen, my movements unhurried, deliberate, and as I placed the tip against the paper, I felt the room settle into a deeper silence. The kind that comes just before something shifts, something that cannot be undone once it begins, and I signed my name exactly where she had indicated, the same careful script, the same controlled motion, completing the action that would confirm everything they believed to be true. Lauren leaned back slightly, a small, satisfied breath escaping her as though the final piece had fallen into place, and Michael exhaled more quietly, his shoulders lowering just enough to suggest relief, and for a brief moment, nothing happened, the room holding that stillness as though it were waiting, as though it understood that the story they believed had just ended was only just beginning. For a moment after I finished signing, the room held a kind of stillness that felt almost ceremonial, as if everything that needed to be said had already been spoken and all that remained was the quiet confirmation of an outcome that had been carefully arranged, and Lauren allowed herself the smallest shift in posture, a subtle straightening of her shoulders, a controlled exhale that suggested not relief but completion, the quiet satisfaction of someone who believes they have executed a plan, without error. Michael glanced at her briefly, then back at the documents, his expression settling into something that looked like acceptance, though it carried a faint trace of something else beneath it, something less certain, but not strong enough to interrupt the moment, not strong enough to change anything that had already been set in motion. Jonathan Pierce did not move immediately, his hands resting lightly on the folder in front of him, his gaze directed not at the documents, not at Lauren or Michael, but at the space between us, as though he were allowing the silence to stretch just long enough to mark the transition from what had been expected to what was about to occur, and I remained exactly as I had been, seated calmly, my hands folded in my lap, my expression unchanged, offering nothing that might suggest anticipation or awareness. "If that completes your review," Jonathan said finally, his voice even, measured, carrying the same quiet authority it had held from the beginning. "There is one additional matter we need to address before these documents can be finalized." The words were simple, almost routine, and yet they landed in the room with a weight that shifted the air in a way that was difficult to name but impossible to ignore, and I saw it immediately in Lauren's reaction, the slight narrowing of her eyes, the brief pause before she responded, the kind of pause that only appears when something unexpected enters a situation that was believed to be fully controlled. "Additional matter," she repeated, her tone still composed, but with a sharper edge now, a hint of impatience carefully restrained, and Jonathan inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the question without yielding to it. "A standard procedural step," he said, though nothing in his tone suggested that it was standard at all, related to the original estate provisions. Michael shifted slightly in his chair, his attention sharpening, his earlier confidence replaced by a more focused stillness, as though he were trying to follow a path that had just taken an unexpected turn, and Lauren leaned forward, her hand resting lightly on the table, her posture signaling control even as the situation began to move beyond it. "We were not informed of any additional provisions," she said, her voice steady but firmer now, and Jonathan allowed a brief pause before responding, not out of hesitation, but as though he were giving the moment the exact amount of space it required to settle properly. "That is correct," he said, "because these provisions are not disclosed until the appropriate conditions have been met." There was a shift then, subtle but unmistakable, the kind that does not need to be announced because it is felt in the way people sit, in the way they breathe, in the way their attention narrows towards something they did not expect to encounter. And I remained still, my gaze directed toward the table, not avoiding eye contact, but not seeking it either, because there was nothing I needed to confirm, nothing I needed to reveal. Jonathan opened the folder in front of him with the same deliberate precision he had shown from the beginning, turning to a section that had not yet been referenced, and as he did, the quiet confidence that had filled the room only moments earlier began to shift into something more uncertain, something less defined. Your husband included a protective clause, he continued, his voice steady, each word placed carefully, designed to ensure that any transfer of assets conducted under conditions of undue influence or misrepresentation would be subject to immediate review and reversal. Lauren's hand stilled on the table, just for a fraction of a second, before she drew it back slightly, her expression tightening in a way that was controlled but no longer entirely composed. And Michael's gaze moved from Jonathan to the documents, and then briefly to me, as though searching for something, some indication that might help him understand what was happening. But I offered nothing, only the same quiet presence I had maintained from the beginning. That does not apply here, Lauren said quickly, her voice regaining its firmness, though now it carried a trace of urgency. Everything has been handled properly. Jonathan nodded once, acknowledging her statement without agreeing with it, and then he continued, his tone unchanged, unaffected by the shift in the room. That determination is not made by assertion, he said, but by the conditions outlined in the clause itself, conditions which, as of this moment, have been met. The words settled into the space between us with a finality that did not require emphasis, and for the first time since we had entered the room, the balance had shifted completely, not through confrontation, not through raised voices or sudden movements, but through something far more precise, far more controlled. And as I sat there, my hands still folded in my lap, my expression unchanged, I understood that the moment they had been working toward, the moment they believed would secure everything they wanted, had just become something else entirely, something they had not prepared for, something they could not easily undo. The silence that followed Jonathan's words did not break immediately. It stretched, thin and tense, like a thread pulled too tight. And for the first time since we had entered the room, Lauren did not speak right away, her composure holding, but just barely, her eyes fixed on the document in front of Jonathan as though she could force it to mean something else simply by refusing to accept what had just been said. That is not possible, she said finally, her voice controlled but sharper now, the confidence still there but no longer effortless, no longer untouched, and Jonathan did not interrupt her, did not rush to respond. He simply allowed her words to settle, as though they were part of a process that needed to unfold in its own time. Everything has been reviewed, she continued, her hand moving slightly across the table, not quite reaching for the documents, but close enough to suggest a need to re-establish control. Every step has been documented properly. Michael shifted beside her, his posture less certain now, his gaze moving between Jonathan and the papers with a focus that suggested he was trying to understand something that had already begun to move beyond him. And I remained still, my hands resting where they had been from the beginning, my presence unchanged, because there was nothing I needed to add, nothing I needed to clarify. Jonathan turned another page, the motion quiet but deliberate, and when he spoke again, his tone carried the same measured precision, unaffected by the tension that had begun to settle into the room. The clause does not depend on intention, he said. It depends on circumstance, and those circumstances are clearly defined. He slid a document forward, not toward Lauren, not toward Michael, but into the center of the table, where it could not be claimed by either of them, and for a moment, neither of them reached for it, as though doing so might confirm something they were not yet ready to accept. Under these conditions, he continued, any transfer of ownership is automatically suspended pending review, and if the criteria are met, which in this case they are, the transfer is rendered null. The word hung in the air with a quiet finality, not loud, not forceful, but complete, and I saw it then, the exact moment the understanding settled, not all at once, not fully, but enough to disrupt the certainty that had carried them this far. Lauren leaned back slightly, her expression tightening in a way that could not be smoothed away, her mind moving quickly, searching for a response, for a way to reframe what had just been presented. And when she spoke again, her voice was steadier, but the edge was still there. "There must be some misunderstanding," she said, each word placed carefully. "We acted in good faith." Jonathan inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the statement without agreeing to it, his gaze steady, unwavering. "Good faith is not the determining factor here," he replied. "The determining factor is whether the conditions outlined in the clause have been met, and they have." Michael exhaled quietly, a sound so soft it might have gone unnoticed in any other moment. But here, in the stillness of that room, it carried a weight of its own, and he looked at Lauren briefly, as though expecting her to resolve this, to restore the balance that had been lost. But she did not look back, her attention fixed entirely on Jonathan now, on the document, on the words that had shifted everything. "What does that mean, exactly?" Michael asked, his voice lower than before, less certain, and Jonathan turned his attention to him without changing his tone. "It means that the transfer you initiated has no legal effect," he said, "and that control of the assets remains as originally established, with additional safeguards now in place." There was no emphasis, no dramatic pause, just a clear statement delivered with the same calm precision as everything else he had said, and yet the impact of it settled heavily into the space between us, reshaping the room in a way that could not be reversed. Lauren's hand, which had rested so confidently on the table before, drew back completely now, folding into her lap, her posture still upright, still controlled, but no longer anchored in certainty, and for the first time, she did not have an immediate response, did not move to fill the silence with explanation or direction. I watched quietly, not with satisfaction, not with vindication, but with a clarity that felt almost detached, because this moment was not about confrontation, it was not about proving anything. It was simply the natural result of something that had been set in place long before any of us had sat down at that table. Jonathan closed the folder gently, the motion final but unhurried, and as he did, the room seemed to settle into a new kind of stillness, one that no longer carried expectation, but resolution, and I remained exactly where I was, my posture unchanged, my expression calm, because there was nothing left for me to do, nothing left for me to say, the outcome unfolding exactly as it needed to, not through force, not through argument, but through the quiet, undeniable weight of the truth. No one spoke immediately after Jonathan closed the folder, and the silence that followed was no longer uncertain or tense. It was settled, complete, the kind of silence that comes when something irreversible has just taken place and everyone in the room understands it, even if they are not yet ready to accept it. Lauren sat, perfectly still, her posture unchanged on the surface, but there was something different in the way she held herself now, a rigidity that had not been there before, as though she were carefully containing a reaction she had not planned for, her gaze fixed on the table in front of her, no longer directing the room, no longer guiding the outcome, but trying to process a reality that did not align with the one she had been certain of just moments earlier. Michael shifted slightly beside her, his hands moving away from the edge of the table and resting in his lap, his shoulders lowered, not in relaxation, but in something closer to realization. And when he looked up, his eyes moved briefly toward me, not with accusation, not with anger, but with a quiet confusion, as though he were seeing me clearly for the first time in a very long while and did not quite know what to make of it. I met his gaze for only a moment, not long enough to create a connection, not long enough to invite anything more, and then I looked away, because there was nothing left to explain, nothing left to resolve between us in that room. Jonathan remained composed, his presence steady and unchanged, as though the shift that had just occurred was simply the natural conclusion of a process that had been set in motion long before any of us had arrived. And when he spoke again, his voice carried the same quiet authority, unaffected by the silence it followed. "You will each receive copies of the updated documents," he said, his tone measured, professional, along with a summary of the applicable provisions. There was no emphasis, no need to reinforce what had already been made clear, and Lauren nodded once, a small, controlled movement that acknowledged the words without engaging with them, without conceding anything beyond what was absolutely necessary. I remained seated for a moment longer, not out of hesitation, but because I understood that the timing of small actions mattered more than anything that could be said. And when I finally stood, my movement was unhurried, deliberate, the same quiet control I had maintained from the beginning, and I smoothed the front of my blouse in a simple, familiar gesture that felt grounding in its normalcy. No one stopped me, no one spoke my name, and I did not expect them to, because whatever they might have said would have belonged to a different version of this moment, one that no longer existed. I picked up my bag from the chair beside me, the same bag I had carried into the room, unchanged in every visible way, and I turned toward the door, my steps steady, my posture straight, moving through the space as though I had always intended to leave exactly like this, without pause, without acknowledgement, without looking back. As I reached the hallway, I could feel the shift behind me, not in sound, but in presence, the quiet awareness of two people recalculating something they had believed was already settled, and I continued forward without slowing, because whatever they were thinking, whatever they were beginning to understand, it no longer required my participation. Outside, the afternoon light felt the same as it had when I arrived, bright, steady, indifferent to what had just taken place inside, and I paused for only a moment before walking toward my car, allowing the air to settle around me, allowing the quiet to return in a way that felt different now, not empty, not uncertain, but complete. When I opened the car door, I caught a brief reflection of myself in the window, and for a second, I studied it, not critically, not with judgment, but with a kind of recognition that had been absent for some time. The lines on my face, the steadiness in my eyes, the calm that did not need to prove itself to anyone. And I understood then that what had happened in that room was not a victory in the way people usually think of it. It was not something that required celebration or acknowledgement. It was simply the restoration of something that had always been mine, something that had never truly been taken, only challenged. I sat down in the driver's seat and closed the door gently, the sound soft, controlled, and for a moment, I did not start the engine. I simply sat there, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, allowing the stillness to settle completely, because I knew that when I left that parking lot, I would not be returning to the same version of my life, not because anything around me had changed, but because I had. They had believed that I would fight, that I would argue, that I would try to reclaim what they thought they had taken, and in preparing for that, they had overlooked something far simpler, far more effective, that I would do nothing at all until the moment when doing nothing became the strongest move I could make. And as I finally turned the key and the engine came to life, I understood with a quiet certainty that did not need to be spoken, that I had not stopped them, I had not confronted them, I had simply allowed the truth to reach them in the only way that mattered, and when it did, there was nothing left for me to say.